Okay, continuing Tales of a Grandfather by Sir Walter Scott. We didn't finish chapter 3, I believe. No, we didn't finish chapter 4, so we're finishing that. And we may start the tale of Sir William Wallace. So David was succeeded by his grandson named Malcolm in 1153 in his 12th year, the eldest son of the brave and generous Prince Henry. Malcolm did homage to the King of England for the possessions
What
which...
homage?
Homage?
Harm.
No, like giving gifts and forming an alliance with.
What's an alliance?
Partnership.
Sorry.
Malcolm did homage to the King of England for the possessions which he had in England. He was so kind and gentle in his disposition that he was usually called Malcolm the Maiden. Malcolm the Maiden was succeeded by his brother William, crowned 24th of December 1165, a son of Prince Henry, and grandson of the good King David. In this time, warriors and men of consequence began to assume what are called armorial bearings, which you may very often see cut upon seals, engraved on silver plate, and painted upon gentlemen's carriages. It is well to know the meaning of this ancient custom. So do you know what they're referring to there?
No, sealskin?
No. Armorial bearings. So during this time, the 12th century, that's when it started.
The Black Death.
What does armorial? It means armour. So it's shields, it's marks that you have on your armour. So
why does it say cut upon seals?
Well, the seals were like, it's not a seal as in an animal. It's like a seal that you would use to stamp something with.
Okay.
So this is the beginning of the heraldric system.
What's the heraldric system?
It's when people have like a shield with a drawing on it to show what they've done in their life.
I know that.
Yeah. But you have to earn it and go through the system. Nobody can just do it themselves. So anyway, in that time of which I'm speaking, the warriors went into battle clad in complete armour, which covered them from top to toe. On their head they wore iron caps called helmets with visors, which
called helmets. They're saying what it means.
Right. You've probably seen these near Bannockburn, but we'll treat with Bannockburn later.
I know what helmets are.
Which came down and protected the face, so that nothing could be seen of the countenance excepting the eyes peeping through bars of iron. But as it was necessary that a king, lord or knight should be known to his followers in battle, they adopted two ways of distinguishing themselves. The one was by a crest, that is, a figure of some kind or other, as a lion or wolf, a hand holding a sword or some such decoration, which they wore on the top of the helmet, as we talk of a coxcomb being the crest of that bird. But besides this mark of distinction, these warriors were accustomed to paint emblematic figures, sometimes of very whimsical kind, upon their shields. These emblems became general, and at length no one was permitted to bear any such armorial device, excepting he either had right to carry it by inheritance, or that such right had been conferred upon him by some sovereign prince. To assume the crest or armorial emblems of another man was a high offence, and often mortally resented, which means you could get killed if you took somebody else's armorial bearings. And to adopt armorial bearings for yourself was punished as a misdemeanour by a peculiar court composed of men called heralds. Why am I looking at you?
Herald?
Well, So the job of a herald was he was in charge of a court to make sure people's armorial bearings were true and that they just hadn't made them up. The job of a herald. Who gave their names to the science called heraldry, which you should know all about, don't you? Well, I'm going to teach you that in a minute then. In fact, no, tomorrow morning.
You don't even know, do you?
I've just explained. But it's been a long time since I read it. I read it when I was a boy of his age, so I'll read to him.
Mum, you read it.
Now, William, King of Scotland, having chosen for his armorial bearing a red lion, rampant, that is standing on its hind legs, he acquired the name of William the Lion. And this rampant lion still constitutes the arms of Scotland. Have you seen the rampant lion? That means standing on his back legs on any flag at all.
Yeah, it's
Right.
the Scottish flag.
Yes, so which king?
William.
William. Right, good.
But Dad, you said you didn't read a book until you were 16.
No, I didn't read any novels, but I had the Nelson's Encyclopedias, which
Dad,
was
do
given
you
to
know
me
when
when I
we
was
went to-
13.
Dad, do you know when we went to Bannockburn?
Yeah.
You know, was it me who was Scottish? Or was it Luke?
Oh, in the reenactment?
Yeah, you were
I don't know.
Scottish.
Probably you.
Yeah, because it was the big... Yeah.
So, what day was William crowned king?
Don't know.
It was your birthday, Rachel, in 1165.
24th of December in 1165.
Right. William, though a brave man, and though he had a lion for his emblem, was unfortunate in war. In the year 1177 he invaded England for the purpose of demanding and compelling restoration of the portion of Northumberland which had been possessed by his ancestors. He himself, with a small body of men, lay in careless security at Alnwick, while his numerous but barbarous and undisciplined army was spread throughout the country, burning and destroying wherever they came. Some gallant Yorkshire barons marched to the aid of their neighbours of Northumberland. They assembled 400 men-at-arms and made a forced march of 24 miles from Newcastle towards Alnwick, without being discovered. On the morning a thick mist fell, and concealed by it, they rode forward towards Alnwick. In their way they suddenly encountered the Scottish king, at the head of a small party of only 60 men. William so little expected a sudden attack of this nature that at first he thought the body of cavalry which he saw advancing was part of his own army. When he was undeceived, he had too much of the lion about him to fear. "Now shall we see," he said, "which of us are good knights," and instantly charged the Yorkshire barons with the handful of men who attended him. But 60 men-at-arms could make no impression on 400, and as the rest of William's army were too distant to give him assistance, he was, after defending himself with the utmost gallantry, unhorsed and made prisoner. The English immediately retreated with their royal captive after this bold and successful adventure. They carried William to Newcastle, and from that town to Northampton, where he was conducted to the presence of Henry II, King of England, with his legs tied under the horse's belly, as if he had been a common malefactor or felon. The English king's subsequent conduct was equally harsh and ungenerous. He would not release his unfortunate captive until he had agreed to do homage to the King of England, not only for his English possessions but also for Scotland and all his other dominions. The Scottish Parliament were brought to acquiesce in this treaty, that means agree with, and thus, in order to recover the liberty of their king, they sacrificed the independence of their country, which remained for a time subject to English claim of paramount sovereignty. This dishonourable treaty was made on the 8th of December 1174, so that was the first time then England took control of Scotland, because they captured King William. So we know about the Union being 17, when? Union of Crowns?
84?
Well, we'll keep guessing then, we'll come back to that if you don't know. But I didn't know about this earlier. They call it a dishonourable treaty because it was made as almost like blackmail to get the king back. In 1189, Henry II died and was succeeded by his son Richard I, one of the most remarkable men in English history. He was so brave that he was generally known by the name Coeur de Lion, that is, the lion-hearted. And he was as generous as he was brave. Nothing was so much at his heart as what was then called the Holy War, that is, a war undertaken to drive the Saracens out of Palestine. For this he resolved to go to Palestine with a large army, but it was first necessary that he should place his affairs at home in such a condition as might ensure the quiet of his dominions during his absence upon the expedition. This point could not be accomplished without his making a solid peace with Scotland, and in order to obtain it, King Richard resolved to renounce the claim of homage, which had been extorted from William the Lion. By a charter dated the 5th of December of the same year, 1189, he restored to the King of Scots the castle of Berwick and Roxburgh, and granted an acquaintance to him of all obligations which Henry II had extorted from him in consequence of his captivity, reserving only Richard's title to such homage as was anciently rendered by Malcolm Canmore. For this renunciation, William paid 10,000 merks, a sum which probably assisted in furnishing the expenses of Richard's expeditions to Palestine. So have you heard of the Holy Wars, Richard Coeur de Lion going across to fight the Saracens in Palestine? No?
Why are they even going to fight them?
Because they wanted Jerusalem for themselves. They didn't want the Palestinians having it. This generous behaviour of Richard of England was attended with such good effects that it almost put an end to all wars and quarrels betwixt England and Scotland for more than 100 years, during which time, with one or two brief interruptions, the nations lived in great harmony together. Right, this is a quick boring part of history. Chapter 5, it's only 2 pages. Alexander II, accession of Alexander III, invasion of the Danes and Battle of Largs.
Wait, did the people, when they were going to Palestine,
Yeah.
Jerusalem,
Yeah.
Did they win?
Well, we'll have to do some research on that, okay?
Why didn't they say?
Because this is dealing with the Scottish history, not English history. You're just laying up, son. Right.
It did say about Romans, didn't it?
Well, yes, well, only because they invaded Scotland, or tried to. So this is 1214 to 1263. William the Lion died at Stirling in December 1214 and was succeeded by his son Alexander II, a youth in years but remarkable for prudence and for firmness. Henry III of England, having occasion to visit his French dominions, committed the care of the northern frontiers of his kingdom to Alexander of Scotland, the prince who was most likely to have seized the opportunity of disturbing them. Alexander II repaid with fidelity the great and honourable trust which his brother sovereign had reposed in him. Relieved from the cares of an English war, Alexander endeavoured to civilise the savage manners of his own people. These were disorderly to a great degree. By the prompt administration of justice, Alexander, what does that say? Because it looks like there's a letter missing. Alexander.
Oh yeah. Both.
Both, maybe, became obeyed and dreaded. Oh yes, because he became obeyed and dreaded. He was a sovereign of considerable power, beloved by both English and Scots. Alexander III, then only in his 8th year, succeeded to his father in 1249. Would you like to be a king when you're only 8? Yet, when only 2 years older, he went to York, at age 10, to meet with the English king and to marry his daughter, the Princess Margaret.
What, when he was 10?
Yeah. On this occasion, Henry endeavoured to revive the old claim of homage. My eyesight's gone, I must have to get glasses.
What's revive? You do have glasses, what are you saying?
Well, I don't use them, do I? I bought cheap rubbish, but I won't be seen dead wearing them. Because,
cheap rubbish?
Yeah, they don't look good on me.
But then you got them from W.H. Smith, and then over at Spexley they were like £150.
Yeah, they only cost me like a tenner, don't they? Anyway,
and they came with a bag.
Yeah, well, that's worth it then. He revived the old claim of homage, which he insisted should be rendered to him by the boy bridegroom for all his dominions. Alexander answered, with wisdom beyond his years, that he was come to marry the Princess of England, and
How old did she get?
Rachel, could I just read now? Talk to me afterwards. And not to treat of affairs of state, and that he could not and would not enter upon the subject proposed without advice of his parliament. In this and on other occasions, Alexander showed great willingness to be on good terms with England, qualified by a sincere resolution that he would not sacrifice any part of the rights and independence of his dominions. In the days of Alexander III, Scotland was threatened with a great danger from the invasion of the Danes and the Norwegians. The Scots had hitherto held these rovers in defiance, but in the year 1263, Hako, King of Norway, at the head of a powerful fleet and army, came to invade and conquer the Kingdom of Scotland. Alexander, on his part, what are you doing? Making a lot of noise there. Alexander, on his part, lost no time in assembling a great army and preparing for the defence of the country, in which he was zealously seconded by most of his nobles. Wait, stop doing that, it's a distraction. On the 1st of October 1263, Hako appeared with his great navy off the village of Largs in Cunningham. The Scots were in arms to defend the shore, but Hako disembarked a great part of his troops and obtained some advantage over them. On the next day, more Scottish troops having come up, the battle was renewed with great fury. Alexander, fighting in person at the head of his troops, was wounded in the face by an arrow. Do we know somebody else who was wounded in his face by an arrow?
Norwegians?
Right in his eye.
No. We read about it just the other day.
William the Conqueror?
No, he lived. He didn't get killed or wounded. It was that battle, Luke. Hastings, and who did William the Conqueror, or maybe one of his army, shoot? Who was the King of England at the time? Who he shot?
Don't know.
Harold. Right. But the Danes lost the nephew of their king, one of the most renowned champions in their host. While the battle was still raging on shore, a furious tempest arose, which drove the ships of the Danes and Norwegians from their anchorage. Many were shipwrecked on the coast, and the crews were destroyed by the Scots when they attempted to get upon land. The soldiers who had been disembarked lost courage and retired before the Scots, who were hourly reinforced by their countrymen, coming from all quarters. It was with the utmost difficulty that Hako got the remnant of his scattered forces on board of such vessels as remained. He retired to the Orkney Islands and there died, full of shame and sorrow for the loss of his army and the inglorious conclusion of his formidable invasion. Orkney Islands, what are they named after?
Whale?
Yes, orcas, killer whales as we know them. Yeah. We should go up there and look at the whales sometimes. Right, so, chapter 6. Another very quick chapter, and then we can get to William Wallace. Some interesting history. This is, I think, a bit boring history. Okay. Death of Alexander III. The Maid of Norway, Competitors for the Crown, Usurpation of Edward of England. This is 1263 to 1296. Alexander, the third of that name, was an excellent sovereign. He married, as I told you in the last chapter, Margaret, daughter of Henry the Third of England. How old was he when he got married?
10.
Right. But unhappily, all the children who were born of that marriage died before their father. After the death of Queen Margaret, Alexander married another wife, but he did not live to have any family by her. As he was riding in the dusk of the evening along the sea-coast of Fife, he approached too near the brink of the precipice, and, his horse starting or stumbling, he was thrown over the rock and killed on the spot.
What?
So Alexander the Third.
I was just doing that.
What?
On homework.
Jumping off a cliff.
I just learned about that.
What else can you add to that story?
He was going back. He was in a castle in Scotland, and then all he could think about was his wife. So he crossed the water when it was stormy, but his servants told him not to, and he still went ahead and did it. He crossed. When he got to land, he rowed until he wasn't seen till the next morning off a cliff.
Right. So this was Alexander the Third. Okay. So you now know more information about him. You know that he was married when he was 10. His first wife produced, all his kids died. And then he had another wife, but he died before her.
I knew that all his kids had died.
The full consequences of the evil were not visible at first, for although all Alexander's children had died before him, yet one of them...
yeah, granddaughter.
Who?
Granddaughter.
Granddaughter?
Yeah, that's the heir to the throne.
Who was that?
Margaret.
Okay. So I've got the names wrong there. This must be the Saint Margaret that we refer to then. Yes, this is the Saint Margaret, not the Margaret who I thought earlier was a saint. Right, and I'll get to you in a second then. So, the full consequences of this evil were not visible at first, for although all Alexander's children had died before him, yet one of them, who had been married to Eric, King of Norway, had left a daughter named Margaret, upon whom, as the granddaughter and nearest heir of the deceased prince, the crown of Scotland devolved. The young princess, called by our historians the Maid of Norway, was residing at her father's court. Well done, Luke, so you remembered Margaret. So she became, Queen of Scotland, I suppose. While the crown of Scotland thus passed to a young girl...
She was only 2 at the time as well.
2?
Queen at 2.
The King of Scotland began to consider by what means he could so avail himself of circumstances as to unite it with his own. The king was Edward I. He was a very brave man and a good soldier, wise, skilful and prudent, but unhappily very ambitious. He proposed a marriage betwixt the Maid of Norway, the young Queen of Scotland, and his own eldest son called Edward, after himself. A treaty was entered into for this purpose, and had the marriage been effective and been followed by children, the union of England and Scotland might have taken place more than 300 years sooner than it did, and an immeasurable quantity of money and bloodshed would have probably have been saved. But the young Queen of Scotland sickened and died, and the treaty for her marriage was ended with her life. Oh, did it say what age she died?
No.
You can't marry somebody aged 2 though, can you? The Kingdom of Scotland was troubled at the death of their young princess.
They said young.
Yeah, certainly must have been very young then, yeah. But there was not any descendant of Alexander III remaining, and who could be considered as his direct heir. And many of the great nobles, who were more or less distantly related to the royal family, prepared to assert a right to the crown, began to assemble forces and form parties, and threatened the country with a civil war, which is the greatest of all misfortunes. To prevent this, the people of Scotland are said to have sent ambassadors to Edward to request his interference as judge.
Panic Man's about to happen then.
Well, we're about to come up to William Wallace soon, yeah. But he had already determined to regulate the succession of the kingdom, and for this purpose he summoned the nobility and clergy of Scotland to meet him at the castle of Norham, a large and strong fortress, which stands on the English side of the Tweed, where that river divides England from Scotland. They met there on the 10th of May 1291 and were presented to the King of England, who received them in great state, surrounded. So this is all the nobles meeting the King of England, trying to figure out who should be the King of Scotland, surrounded by the high officers of his court. He was a very handsome man and so tall that he was popularly known by the name of Longshanks, that is, long legs. The judiciary of England then informed the nobility and clergy of Scotland, in King Edward's name, that before he could proceed to decide who should be the vassal king of Scotland, it was necessary that they should acknowledge the King of England's right as Lord Paramount, or sovereign of that kingdom. The nobles and churchmen of Scotland were surprised to hear the King of England propose a claim which had never been admitted, except for a short time, in order to procure the freedom of King William the Lion, and which had been afterwards renounced forever by Richard I. They refused to give any answer until they should consult together by themselves. So this is the English king saying, look, I'll help you choose.
Have they died? And then they're trying to choose who's king.
Yes.
Then...
This is the King of England,
okay.
trying to help the Scots nobles decide who's going to be king. But the English king has turned around and said, look, I'll help you choose, but I'm going to be Lord Paramount, which means no matter who you choose, I'm going to be the king of all the land, England and Scotland anyway, if you allow me to help you. Do you think they'll allow to do that? No, of course they won't. So, by St. Edward, said the king, whose crown I wear, I will make good my just rights, or perish in the attempt. He then dismissed the assembly, allowing the Scots a delay of 3 weeks, however, to accede to his terms. The Scottish nobility, being thus made aware of King Edward's selfish and ambitious designs, ought to have assembled their forces together and declared that they would defend the rights and independence of their country, but they were much divided among themselves and without any leader. Accordingly, the second assembly of the Scottish nobility and clergy took place without anyone having dared to state any objection to what the King of England proposed. They were assembled in a large open plain, opposite to the castle of Norham, but on the Scottish side of the river. The Chancellor of England then demanded of such of the candidates as were present whether they acknowledged the King of England as Lord Paramount of Scotland, and whether they were willing to receive and hold the crown of Scotland as awarded by Edward in that character. They all answered that they were willing to do so, and thus, rather than hazard their own claims by offending King Edward, these unworthy candidates consented to resign the independence of their country, which had been so long and so bravely defended. Upon examining the claims of the candidates, the right of succession to the throne of Scotland was found to lie chiefly betwixt Robert Bruce, the Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, who was the Lord of Galloway. Both were great and powerful barons. Both were of Norman descent. Did you know that?
No.
Robert the Bruce and Norman Balliol were Normans. So they'd been given these lands in the Norman conquest. Or their fathers had, or their grandfathers had.
Yeah.
And they also had great estates in England as well as Scotland. Did you know that? Lastly, both were descended from the Scottish royal family, and each by a daughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon, brother of William the Lion. Edward, upon due consideration, declared Balliol to be the King of Scotland, as being son of Margaret, the eldest of the two sisters. But he declared that the kingdom was always to be held under him as the Lord Paramount thereof. John Balliol closed the disgraceful scene by doing homage to the King of England and acknowledging that he was his liege, vassal and subject. So that's horrible, isn't it? He's just said, okay, you made me king and now you are the leader of us all. He's just given up his country, basically, John Balliol. Soon after this shameful transaction, King Edward began to show to Balliol that he was determined to exercise his right of sovereignty. Have you got any water there, Rich? Can I just have a quick drink of it? Cheers. Any left?
If anyone.
Thanks. Is that, what was in there?
Milk and water.
Well, it wasn't cow's milk, so that's okay.
No, I've washed all the milk sludge off it.
You describe it so well. I'll have some. Just give me sludge next time.
No, it's actually when milk gets left in a cup for
I
too
know
long,
what you mean,
it gets
yeah.
all sludgy
Yeah.
at the bottom and horrible.
Yeah.
I've left it in my room for too long and it's got all sludgy and much hard sludge at the bottom. And we're nearly at the end.
Oh,
Yeah.
Soon after this shameful transaction, King Edward began to show to Balliol that he was determined to exercise his right of sovereignty on every possible occasion. He did this, no doubt, on purpose to provoke the dependent king to some act of resistance, which would give him a pretext for depriving him of the kingdom altogether. Edward also insisted upon having possession of three principal fortresses of Scotland: Berwick, Roxburgh and Jedburgh. Balliol surrendered, or at least agreed to surrender.
Do you like this better than Ivanhoe?
This is just the history of Scotland. Ivanhoe is a novel in its own. Ivanhoe is a great novel. Well, I'll tell you what, you'll be able to determine because we'll read Ivanhoe next.
No.
Balliol surrendered,
Watch the movie.
or at least agreed to surrender these castles, but the people murmured against this base compliance, and Balliol himself, perceiving that it was Edward's intention gradually to destroy his power, was stung at once with shame and fear, and entering into a league with France, raised a great army for the purpose of invading the dominions of the prince whom he had so lately acknowledged as his Lord Paramount. So that's where the French connection came in. He needed the French army's help. Balliol, because he'd unwittingly agreed to let the English rule them. At the same time, he sent a letter to Edward, formally renouncing his dependence upon him. Edward replied in Norman French, "Ha! Dares this idiot commit such folly? Since he will not attend on us, as is his duty, we will go to him." The King of England accordingly assembled a powerful army, amongst which came Bruce, who had formerly contended for the crown of Scotland with
Is this
Balliol.
the Battle of Bannockburn?
It's leading up to it, yeah.
Is this where they...
Let's see, let's see.
The Battle of Bannockburn, the Bannockburn, 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 the Battle of Bannockburn.
What was the date of the Battle of Bannockburn?
1314.
Good guess. Could possibly be right.
That is
Hey,
it.
don't
I'm
push
sure.
into me. Right.
That's definitely it. Sure.
The King of England accordingly assembled a powerful army, amongst which came Bruce, who had formerly contended the crown of Scotland with Balliol, and who had hoped to gain it upon his forfeiture. Edward defeated the Scottish army in a great battle near Dunbar. Do you know where Dunbar is, don't you?
Yeah, it's where they have this big pool, and you know Dunbar Beach, and how they have the little square bit around the sea, so you can go and play in it.
Yeah.
That's Dunbar, and where we got the ice creams, but Mum wanted one.
Okay, let's not go into our ice cream gate story, okay. And Balliol, who appears to have been a mean-spirited man, gave up the conquest. He came before Edward in the castle of Roxburgh, and there made a most humiliating submission. He appeared in a mean dress, without sword, royal robes, or arms of any kind, bearing in his hand a white wand. He there confessed that through bad counsel and folly he had rebelled against his Lord Liege, and in atonement he resigned the kingdom of Scotland with the inhabitants, and all rights which he possessed to their obedience and duty to their liege Lord King Edward. He was therefore permitted to retire uninjured. Balliol being thus removed, Bruce expressed his hopes of being allowed to supply his place as tributary King of Scotland. But Edward answered him sternly, "Have we nothing, think you, to do, but to conquer kingdoms for you?" Edward marched through Scotland at the head of a powerful army, compelling all ranks of people to submit to him. He removed to London the records of the Kingdom of Scotland, and was at the pains to transport to the Abbey Church at Westminster a great stone. Do you know what stone that is?
What? Oh, Edinburgh Rock, you know that big...
Well, I think it resides in Edinburgh now, I'm not sure.
You know,
What was the stone called?
I don't know.
Oh, the one that they sit on, the one rolls.
Yes, what's it called?
What, the one in Edinburgh?
The Rock of Destiny.
Stone of Destiny. Well done, Lou. Good.
That was not it.
They got mixed up
I mean the one in Edinburgh.
Well,
Edinburgh
presumed.
Street or something.
So Edward's moved now. He's taken the Stone of Destiny to the Abbey Church at Westminster, upon which it has been the national custom to place the King of Scotland when he was crowned for the first time. So that was the Stone of Destiny, which was taken out of Scotland and to the Abbey Church of Westminster. He did this to show that he was absolute master of Scotland. The country was in future to have no other king but himself, and his descendants the kings of England. The stone is still preserved, and is to this day the king's throne is placed upon it at the time when he is crowned. Last of all, King Edward placed the government of Scotland in the hands of the Earl of Surrey, a brave nobleman, a chief treasurer and a chief judge. He placed English soldiers in all the castles and strongholds of Scotland, from the one end of the kingdom to the other, and appointed English governors in most of the provinces of the kingdom. So there we go. Scotland became under English rule thanks to Balliol. And next, we haven't got to Bannockburn yet because this is all the
Are
story.
you being sarcastic when you're saying thanks?
Well, would you press stop there, Rachel, please?